So this morning, I want to talk about bowing to reluctance and the topic of reluctance in our lives. And I view this as a milder form of avoidance, but it can be so subtle that sometimes we don't even notice it. It just kind of creeps up on us. But we know that avoidance of anything at any level avoidance of anything that makes us uncomfortable can increase our suffering. And we encounter reluctance all the time, a quiet resistance that arises in the face of uncertainty, fear, discomfort, whatever. And reluctance in its many forms can manifest as a hesitation to embrace change. It can be a barrier to change. It can ask us to avoid difficult truths or not seeing things as they really are, or procrastination in the face of necessary action. And from a Buddhist perspective, reluctance is not an enemy to be conquered, but a teacher to be understood. Bowing to reluctance, meaning, and when we talk about bowing in Buddhism, we talk about honoring something or embracing something, respecting something. Bowing to reluctance, rather than fighting it, is an act of mindfulness and acceptance that can lead us to greater inner peace and spiritual growth. In the teachings of the Buddha, reluctance can be seen as a natural expression of the human condition. And it's probably rooted in one of the three poisons: greed, aversion, and delusion. Often reluctance arises from aversion, our desire to avoid discomfort or pain or inconvenience. But it may also stem from delusion if we fail to see the transient or impermanent nature and interconnected nature of the challenges before us. In this way, reluctance, it's not a flaw, it's not a weakness, it's a conditioned response, shaped by our attachments and shaped by our aversions over many, many years. But the Buddha taught that suffering, as you know, arises from clinging and resistance. So when we resist the present moment, even in a subtle way, even in the form of reluctance, we don't want to let go. It's a reluctance to act. It's a reluctance to face reality. We create tension. We create struggle within ourselves. And reluctance becomes a barrier, not because it exists often, but because we fight it. We label it as wrong or bad. I shouldn't be having this. What's wrong with me? When we notice it. But the Buddhist teachings invites us, as with all avoidance, to approach reluctance differently, with mindfulness, with compassion, and what I call a willingness to bow to it. It's the physical act of bowing, as you know, as I just mentioned, is a gesture of humility, of surrender, of reverence, and of acceptance. And it symbolizes the recognition of something greater than the self, the willingness to let go of our ego in that moment. Similarly, bowing to reluctance it's a metaphorical practice of accepting the presence of something without judgment or resistance. It's letting go, it's yielding to it, it's leaning into it. And it doesn't mean that giving into inaction or avoidance, but creating space around it to fully experience and understand it. And when reluctance arises, mindfulness becomes our guide, because by observing it with curiosity and openness, we recognize and investigate its roots. So what is the source of this hesitation that we call reluctance? Well, often it's a fear of failure. I don't want to do it because I might mess it up. I don't want to do it because I might get it wrong. I don't want to do it because I don't really know how to do it. So fear of failure often is the thing that causes this hesitation or reluctance. Another aspect of it is discomfort with uncertainty. If I give into this reluctance, I don't know where it's going to take me. If I move ahead, I might stumble, I might mess up again. Discomfort with uncertainty. And then thirdly is our old friend, attachment to a specific outcome. If I yield to reluctance, I have to give up whatever I'm clinging to. I have to give up this belief or this idea or this position that I'm holding on to. But with mindful observation, we cultivate insight into the nature of our reluctance, seeing it not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity to overcome some of these barriers, as an opportunity for growth. For example, suppose I'm reluctant to forgive a past hurt. Someone has offended me or hurt me. And I just can't let that go. But by bowing to my reluctance, I acknowledge its presence without suppressing it, pushing it away, or indulging it. I discover that my reluctance stems from a fear of vulnerability, which we talked about on Wednesday and which Susan so clearly shared with us, or clinging to the identity of being wrong. This understanding paves the way for compassion, both for myself and for others, and ultimately, in this case, for the liberation that forgiveness brings. It frees us up. Now, bowing to reluctance, as is so often the things we talk about, does not mean passivity. It does not mean complacency. It means that we emphasize the importance, as the Buddha taught, of right effort as part of the Noble Eightfold Path. Right effort involves cultivating wholesome states of mind while abandoning unwholesome states. And in the context of reluctance, this means not forcing ourselves to act against our will or allowing reluctance to paralyze us. We walk the middle way, as the Buddha often taught, balancing acceptance with gentle effort. Balancing acceptance with gentle effort. When we bow to reluctance, we create a space for skillful action to arise. So rather than pushing through resistance or reluctance with brute force or gritted teeth, we approach it with patience and wisdom, which often means taking small, mindful steps toward the task we are avoiding. Or alternately, we can just simply sit with the discomfort until some clarity arises. Sometimes we just have to sit with the discomfort and see what comes up. But by honoring our reluctance, we transform it from a source of suffering to a gateway for compassionate action. But as always, we must first notice when it's arising. Oh, reluctance is arising. I can just feel that subtle form of resistance. I can just feel myself kind of stopping, not wanting to go forward. And then once we notice it, we pause and bring wisdom to it. I notice it. There's reluctance. I pause, and then I give myself an opportunity to bring some wisdom to it. What's going on now? As Pat Coffey says, what's my internal weather system at the moment? Because in our practice, every experience without exception, pleasant or unpleasant, has the potential to teach us something about reality. Things as they are, not as we wish them to be. Every experience has that potential, and reluctance is no exception. It invites us, when we come at it with wisdom and discernment, to confront our fears, to examine our attachments, however subtle, and to deepen our understanding of impermanence. When we bow to reluctance, we acknowledge that it too is part of the ever-changing flow of existence, ever-changing flow. Everything's in flux. Like all mental states, it arises, it lingers, and eventually passes away. Reluctance is no different than any other mental state. And it teaches us the importance of self-compassion, because when we pay attention to it, then we can respond to it, not with judgment, not with self-criticism, but with, here's reluctance again. Let me see where this is going. Let me respond with some compassion. Because too often, I think, and this has certainly been true in my life, we judge ourselves harshly for hesitating, for resistance. Oh, why is this coming up? What's wrong with me? Why can't I just push ahead? Because we somehow believe that the standard is that we're always decisive, never indecisive, always productive, and always fearless, all of which are impossible standards. But remember that the Dharma reminds us that we're human, subject to the same vulnerabilities of all beings. By treating reluctance with kindness, we cultivate the compassion that extends not only to ourselves, but to everybody else that's struggling with it in the same day. To bow to reluctance is to embrace it as part of the human experience. And in that way, it is an act of humility. And by which I mean we are acknowledging that we do not control every aspect of our minds or our lives. It's an act of humility, but it's also an act of courage, because we're facing our resistance and our reluctance with openness rather than denial. We don't push it aside, we face it with courage. And finally, it's an act of wisdom, recognizing that even reluctance has something to teach us. Every moment, if we allow it, is a teachable moment. In the end, bowing to reluctance is not overcoming it, it's not eliminating it, but it's transforming our relationship with it. It's making friends with it. Because when we meet reluctance with mindfulness, with compassion, and with acceptance, we dissolve the barriers that it creates, and we reconnect with the flow of the present moment. We reconnect with the truth of impermanence. And in this way, reluctance is not a hindrance, but a stepping stone on the path to less suffering. So bowing to reluctance.